Good morning, students. Myself Vijay Badoria, Study Point Inter College, Khairabad, Sitapur. Today I am going to explain you topic geometrical meaning of the zeros of a polynomial. Now see this graph. This graph is for the polynomial y equal to 2x plus 3. In this graph, this line cuts x-axis at only one point. So this polynomial y equal to 2x plus 3 is having number of zeros only 1. Okay, number of zeros for this polynomial is 1 because this line cuts x-axis at only one point. Now students, see this graph. This graph is for the polynomial y equal to x square minus 3x minus 4. For this polynomial, graph is in the shape of parabola. It cuts x-axis at two different points. First, this graph cuts at this point and it cuts this graph at this point. So for this polynomial y equal to x square minus 3x minus 4, this polynomial is having number of zeros 2 because this graph cuts x-axis at 2 points. Now students, see this graph. This cuts x-axis at two different points. First it cuts at this point and again this cuts at x-axis at this point. So this polynomial having number of zeros 2 because this curve cuts x-axis at 2 points. Similarly, this graph also cuts x-axis at 2 points, a dash and a. So number of zeros for this also be 2. See this graph. In this graph, it touches only x-axis. This graph touches the x-axis. On touching, it has for number of zeros only 1. Since this graph touches the x-axis, so it has number of zeros 1. This also touches the x-axis. This also touches the x-axis, so number of zeros are only 1. Now students, see these two graphs. In this graph, curve is not touching the x-axis. In this graph, curve is not touching the x-axis. It means the polynomial is not having any zero, means no zero is there. In this graph also, this curve is not touches the x-axis, so there will be no zero. Now students, see this graph. In this graph, this graph is for the polynomial y equal to x cube minus 4x. It starts from here and it cuts x-axis at one point. After going, it cuts again second time and again it third time. So this graph has number of zeros 3. This polynomial. So this polynomial is having number of zeros 3 because the graph cuts x-axis at 1 point, 2 point and 3 point. 3 times, since this graph cuts x-axis at 3 points, so there are number of zeros are 3. Now students, see these two graphs. In this graph is for the polynomial y equal to x cube. In this graph, it starts from this point and it after passing through x-axis, it's go upside. It only touches only x-axis or cuts x-axis at one point. This pass from here, it cuts x-axis only 1 point, so number of zeros for the polynomial y equal to x cube is 1. And see this graph, it starts from here. First time it touches x-axis at this point and second time it this point and go upside. It means for the polynomial y equal to x cube minus x square, it has number of zeros 2. So for the polynomial y equal to x cube minus x square, number of zeros are 2 because the graph first time cuts touches this point, and after that it at this point it touches x-axis at 2 times. So this polynomial y equal to x cube minus x square is having number of zeros 2. Now see these graph. In this graph, curve cuts x-axis at this point, so number of zeros for this graph is 1. In this graph it cuts x-axis, graph cuts x-axis at 2 different points, so number of zeros for the polynomial are 2. In this graph it this graph this curve cuts x-axis at 1 point, second point and third point. First it starts from here, it goes and cuts, again it comes and cuts, again it goes and cuts. So it cuts x-axis at 3 points, 1, 2 and 3. So number of zeros are 3 for this polynomial. For this straight line cuts x-axis at only 1 point, so number of zeros for this line is 1. In this graph, see this curve touches the only touches the x-axis, so number of zeros in case of touching, number of zeros will be 1. Okay, so since this graph touches the x-axis, so number of zeros for this graph is 1. Since this graph start from here and it cuts x-axis at this point, goes and again cuts at this point, go and again cuts this point, go and again cuts this point. So cutting points are 1, 2, 3, 4. So for this graph number of zeros are 4 because it cuts x-axis at 1 point, 2 point, 3 point and 4 point. Now students, come on exercise 2.1. See this first the graph of y equal to px are given in the figure for some polynomial px. Find the number of zeros of px in each case. Find the number of zeros of px in each case. See this, in this straight line do not cuts x-axis, so this for this polynomial number of zeros are 0. There is no 0 for this graph. See this graph, in this graph it cuts x-axis at only 1 point, so number of zeros will be 1. See this graph, in this graph it starts from here and first it cuts x-axis at this point, again it goes upside and comes downside and it cuts x-axis at 1 point, second times again, and then it goes down and comes again upside, so and cuts x-axis at third point. It cuts x-axis at 1, 2 and 3 points, so number of zeros will be 3 for this curve. Now see this graph cuts x-axis at 2 points, so number of zeros for this polynomial will be 2. See this graph, it cuts x-axis at 1 point, 2 point, 3 point and 4 point. This graph cuts x-axis at points 1, 2, 3 and 4. So number of zeros will be 4 because this graph cuts x-axis at 1, again 2, 3 and 4. This graph cuts x-axis at 4 points, 1, 2, 3 and 4. So number of zeros will be 4. Now see this graph, it starts from here, cuts x-axis at 1 point and here it touches second time, again it goes upside and come downside and again touches the x-axis at 1 point. So 1, 2, 3. Number of zeros for this polynomial will be 3. Thank you. And after this, I will explain you the topic relationship between zeros and coefficient of a polynomial. What will be the our next topic? Relationship between zeros and coefficient of a polynomial. Thank you.